I was already presented by Jens kindly, but this is really a review of what we found out so far in the lagoon fishery in southern Baltic Sea, and then just presenting the collective work of many people in my lab, but also collaborators in the region who have put together data sets they had on the environment and so on. But there's also many anglers and guides involved that helped us with tagging fish and capturing fish. So this is a huge collective effort. And again, it's halfway through the project. It's just the current state of understanding that we have on that fishery. So I bring you here to the southern Baltic Sea around the island of Rügen, exactly between Hiddensee, Rügen, and there's also the Odra estuary here. It's, again, as Christian said, living at the salinity edge. If you look at this broad scale salinity pattern, so something beyond 7.5 to 11 PSU in this area. But if you look closer, these lagoons that we call bodden are really different from each other. So overall, we are talking an area here of around 200,000 hectares. These are choked lagoons, meaning that some of them have more connection to the Baltic, others are more isolated. For example, here the Sala bodden or the Kleiner Jasmunder bodden. And they are really functioning a little bit like shallow lakes. So they are like 3 to 5 meters depth. Some are shallower than that. They get lots of nutrients from the river Oder estuary and other estuaries. And the less connection you have to the outside Baltic, the more eutrophied they have become. So what you see here, these brownish areas are really strongly eutrophied systems with water visibilities less than a meter, often just 50 centimeters. So it's pike perch habitat. It's not pike habitat. And the pike habitat is mainly here on Western Rügen and in former times also this Greifswald Bay. So that's overall a gradient of salinity from east to west here, but also from northeast to southwest. And so the salinity varies as well as the trophic conditions. And in that sense, the general suitability as the pike habitat varies. But there's pike everywhere. Just the major fisheries are here west of Rügen and in former times the Greifswalder bodden. So there has been an historic fishery here, mainly on spring spawning herring, because actually this Greifswalder Bay is actually a major spawning site for herring. So the fishery here is it's a small scale fishery on multiple species, but herring historically has been the dominant species. But also freshwater fish, including pike, are exploited, and the main fishing gear by the commercial fishermen nowadays is gill nets, but there's also a few fyke nets still present and some long line. But by far the most pike nowadays are harvested by gill nets. If you look at the development of the yield, you see here on the top the yield of the lagoon commercial fishermen. Nowadays there are around 150 left that catch at least some pike, and then these numbers have been declining over time. But you see that the total yield has been dominated by herring. But in recent years, the spring spawning herring, but also the autumn spawning herring is strongly declining, and the quotas are shrinking. So that's why this green area is reduced, because they're simply not allowed to harvest as much. But the freshwater fish, perch, pike, but also the cyprinids, have seen, despite a decline in the numbers of commercial fishermen in the lagoons, quite stable yield since the German reunification. And pike, this yellow band, is not of major importance within that. So around 1% of the coastal yield, of the yield of the coastal fish and the revenue is by pike. Of course, this varies by individual fishers, and there are a few for which pike is a dominant source of income, or at least around 50%. But on average, it's only 1%. And the revenues overall, the maximum we ever recorded based on official data is 210,000 euro. That is pike-based, of overall 7 million euros revenue that the coastal fishery generates. So it's a modest contribution to that total revenue. The total yield of the commercial fishermen has been declining. And as previous speakers have talked about, if you just look at total yield, this does not necessarily indicate stock size, because effort might also change. There are changes in market situation and so on, but there's a very, very strong decline from around 200 to 250 tons produced in the commercial yield by pike to nowadays only 30 to 40 tons. And we are very convinced that there is also a decline in the stock underlying this trend. In recent years, the dominant source of removal is no longer the commercial fishery, but actually recreational anglers have becoming quite important also in the removal of pike, which brings us to the second big sector in the area, which is recreational fishing, which is done by boats, but also by shore-based fishing, fly fishing, and so on. And this sector has really risen since the German reunification and has at some point even reached some celebrity status. So big football players have been going to Rügen to catch one of these big pikes. Miroslav Klose might be known to some of you, but Zlatan Ibrahimovic, I think, is a legend in Sweden. So he has been seen around Rügen catching some of these trophy pikes. So the fishery is quite famous nowadays, also internationally, and generates a substantial tourism, which you can see in the development of the coastal licenses for recreational fishing, which is the red curve here that has shown a very strong increase, while the resident fishing licenses of the area of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where this fishery is located, has been pretty stable. So most of that rise is actually by tourism. But in recent years, since 2016, there's a decline of interest in the coast. So we have reached a maximum or even a decline. The pandemic is one contributor, but also changes in cod bag limits and other changes in coastal fish stocks have contributed to a decline. We have pretty good data from colleagues from the Institute who did a diary survey from 2014-2015, where we can quantify this, and we have around 50,000 lagoon anglers, 35,000 of which are non-resident tourists, and they spent about half of the total effort of 400,000 trips in that year. This generates 42 million euro of revenue in the area of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which feeds around 420 jobs that are only dependent on that coastal angling, and around half of that is pike-based. So pike is the major single fishery in those lagoon fisheries behind that economic revenue. We nowadays have also a guiding sector that caters to these non-local people. There's rental boat system, there's infrastructure. So particularly in the early 2000s until the until 2015, this has been really a boom in Rügen, and after that, a decline, which we think is also related to a declining pike stock. So what do these anglers expect? We studied using surveys, motivations, prime motivations of bottom anglers, lagoon anglers, and red, compared to the same anglers catching these freshwater fish in freshwater systems. And you see here the pike targeted trips that much of the effort, the prime motivation is either to catch a trophy pike, which in the German culture is something above 1 meter total length, and to get some form of challenge-seeking motivation satisfied, because these are vast areas, lots of wind. It's sometimes difficult to find the pike, so there is some challenge aspect to catching the pike in these lagoons that people like. But there's also consumption. So it's not that people just go there and catch and release fish. The release rates are today 60%, and they have risen from 30 to 60% within a period of 10 years. But there are a sizable fraction of people that go there to catch fish for consumption and remove the pike after capture. We have also asked the anglers what they perceive about the pike stock, and our project was initiated by concerns that there's something going on in the system that is reducing catch rates. So we have asked in a survey here over 600, 700 people what their perception is about the stock development, and the vast majority says that over 80, around 80% say that the stock of the pike and also the stock of the trophy pike has been somewhat or strongly decreasing since they started fishing in the area. And this also maybe a little bit less holds for the own catches. So we can conclude that the vast majority of people that have knowledge about the area perceive a decline. And now you can ask, everybody says that, right? The past has always been nicer and rosier than it is today. So what's the objective backup of this perception? Again, I would say from management, it often does not really matter whether this is a real or a perceived decline, because conflicts will emerge just by perceptions already. But of course, from a scientific perspective, we want to know what's the scientific backup of that claim. So a colleague of mine Rob van Gemmert, who will give a separate talk on this, and I'm not going to steal all his insights now in this overview presentation, just a summary picture here of his catch-only stock assessment. So we did reconstructions of total landings, commercial and recreation combined, and Rob did stock assessment modeling with this. And the result is that the current fishing pressure is at or beyond the level that we would consider biologically sustainable. So the fishing mortality rates currently acting on the stock are larger than the one that would produce maximum sustainable yield. This also means that the current stock size is above around half of what the unexploited stock size would be. And this comes along with a reduction in the mean size of the stock. And particularly the anglers who like high catch rates and high sizes of fish will be feeling this decline because this is really reducing the angling quality. So we conclude that there is some backup to what the anglers are perceiving, and the stock assessment says that the stock is shrinking since about 2010, where we see around 10 or 12 years of decline in the stock size now. Multiple pressures can be now put forward. The usual suspects have been mentioned multiple times. I don't need to repeat all of them. And it's really hard for us scientists to really pinpoint what's going on because, as Jens Olsen already mentioned, the monitoring, fishery independent monitoring data are basically lacking. We don't have those data for the region, and that makes it almost impossible to look back and see what's going on. What we did is look at multiple lines of evidence and kind of did a qualitative assessment of what we think are the main factors affecting the fishery. This is put together in this slide, and I will go through them briefly. So there are environmental factors, there are factors related to recruitment, the spawning habitat and the availability of prey. Then there are the natural predators here on the top and the fishing on the right in yellow. And the less color you see here in the arrows, the less we think it's a major relevance. It might be still of local relevance in certain lagoons, but we don't think that these shaded factors are of major relevance for the overall picture. And I give you an example of salinity, which is one factor that many anglers, for example, prefer. They often think that we have these influxes of big saline water and that this is causing a recruitment bottleneck. Here are some unpublished data by a colleague, Sören Müller from University of Rostock, who actually used coastal pike captured at the station of Ummanz and did the hatching and fry development experiments in the lab. And if you look at this gray line, this is the egg to fry survival rate of these fish. And what Christian Skowick just said, we see that the fitness, the egg to fry survival is highest at intermediate salinities. It drops again at 10 PSU, but the values are there very similar to what these fish would do in freshwater system. So even at 10 PSU, you would get some recruitment according to this data. If you then look at the long-term development of the average annual salinities during the spawning time in our area, you see variation across the different lagoons on average, but you don't see that these highest bottlenecks of 9, 10 PSU are systematically crossed. And there's actually, if at all, even a declining trend in salinity. So we don't think that on a broad scale, salinity has been an issue. It might be in selected years and selected lagoons, but we don't think this can explain this massive decline in the pike overall stock. The second suspect is spawning habitat. We all know pike love macrophytes. And indeed, if you look back many years from the 40s to today, you see that, for example, the Greifswalder Lagoon, you saw a huge decline in submerged macrophytes due to rutification. But in the recent years, since 2000s, these changes have not happened. So it's pretty stable, the macrophyte coverage, since the time where we see the pike decline. And the very same happens with the loss of wetlands. In historical times, lots of streams were blocked by water management, but it's not happening the last 20, 25 years. The situation has not changed very much, so we probably affected the recruitment in historical times, but not in recent years. We don't think this is a major factor. And so we went through all these other factors. One aspect that I think might affect the stock is the reduction in prey. particularly the influx of energy through the herring migration, and we have a huge decline in the herring stock. So this might change availability of energy because this is new energy coming into the lagoons, and we have a strong decline there. We also see very big increases in natural predators, not so much the seals, which are only in the Greifswald Bay. They are not very prominent in other areas compared to what I know from Sweden, for example, but the cormorants have strongly increased, and perhaps their predation pressure has some impact on recruitment. But what we think is the major factor in the last 10 years is fishing. And it's not just commercial fishing, but particularly also recreational fishing. And of course, recreational fishing will notice an impact, particularly through the catch rates that happens on the gear. Here are some unpublished data of catch rates on angling gear by experimental angling that we did in protected areas where both fishing and angling is constrained. Often there's still something going on, but it's definitely less than outside. And you see that the average catch rate is 3, 4, 5 times higher in these protected areas. If there would be an underlying environmental factor, we wouldn't see pike in the protected areas either. But we do see huge accumulation of fish there, of big fish. 14% of the fish are over 1 meter length. We also do see that these fish move around outside the protected areas. And we did recently complete a fishing mortality rate assessment based on microcapture data. And preliminary result is that we have a current fishing mortality rate of 0.2, which is beyond what we would consider sustainable based on the natural mortality rates of pike. So in recent times, also the fishers are generating at least 50 to 75% of the catch. So there is also a shift in what is the dominant fishing sector in terms of yield. But overall, we have the feeling that fishing pressure is a major factor in this fishery. So to summarize, this is a list of factors that we think affect our stock. The stock is declining. The catch rates are not as big in the past. The pike sizes are declining, but it varies by lagoon. We do think that cumulatively fishing mortality has an effect. It might also affect catch rates through the selection of timid fishes that are simply not so vulnerable anymore, a factor that we are analyzing. But there are also some other factors that we should not discount, such as impaired recruitment habitat, decline in herrings, cormorant predation, increasing water clarity in some areas that might affect catchability and change where the pike are, and warming, which might affect the mortality rates as well. We think that there's only local importance of salinity effects, maybe west of Rügen, stickleback predation and seals, perhaps in the Greifswald lagoon, and we would exclude pollution and disease as being of major relevance. So that's our current overview. Again, many people to thank, including our funding bodies, and I'm looking forward to discussing this over the course of the conference.
Thank you.